Video 40. US and Iran. What happens next? This is why there is such a procrastination over the idea of whether or not there's going to be a war between the US and Iran. As if we follow the line which runs through the whole of history, then it looks inevitable from the US side that they want to have a war because of the need to create a new world order, which is being the whole key to its whole strategy globally. And so perhaps the war on the Iranian side is directed at not having a war. So let's have a look at the dynamics here and see whether or not it looks like they're going to have a war, what happens either way, and what the difference is. So essentially, everyone should know the way we are actually heading into the Anthropocene is being created by the official periods of history. So as we can see from the structure of that in an abstract sense, the phases of the Cold War, so that would be the first period, 1946 to I think it's 53, and then the period to, so that involved the Korean War, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and then there was the Détente period when things calmed down, which was 62 to kind of right about the Vietnam War, and then there was the period up to Gorbachev, which led to more openness and the fall of the Soviet Union, eventually then in 92, which was the next phase. So these phases, each phase started to have more of an impact on the present than the whole of history as they became more extreme during what became known as the Great Acceleration. And what we're really seeing happen here really is that the modernization of politics is reaching such an intense level that things are changing faster through the way that these periods occurred, so as to lead into a state of continual change. And that's really how we dissolve the postmodern era, and this is brought in the Anthropocene. So we can see then that the post-Cold War phase led to the problem of terrorism, the war on terror, and then that's why the multipolar phase became seen as the solution. And now we have the problem of that allowing these wars, which can be seen to exist due to kind of fractures or weak kind of areas in the world system where there's not enough political cohesion to prevent wars from happening, but it is capable of supporting the Anthropocene as well. So that now the problem seems to be that the world wants to have a war to solve the problem as a whole, but it's too late because the world's already entered the Anthropocene and the dynamics which cause the problem no longer exist. So this seems to be why US is saying, right, let's get rid of this Iran regime, get rid of the past, and then what we can do is we can restore the Iranian nation to its traditional Shiite Muslim ruler and have it reincorporated into the Middle East. So unifying the Middle East will mean that it's no longer China or Russia's problem. And Russia said that after the Ukraine war that they were going to focus on their own sovereignty, so that would fit in with that. So that's the kind of big reason why there might be a war between US and Iran. So on the other hand then, we've got the fact that the kind of what you might call the old world order really doesn't have a plan really. It's more of a kind of series of nations. And so Iran doesn't really want to have a war with the US that it's going to lose, and millions of people could die. So I think what's going to happen here is that the multiplicity of the multipolar phase, they're going to use that to kind of diffuse the issue politically. And this seems to be all that's enabling the world system involving the United Nations, in particular the General Assembly, to operate right now, as it must tolerate the wars which have broken out, while the dynamics of the situation overall points to the need to create a kind of the shift into the new age really is the solution, as a move towards a more unified world system is required, or else by definition then the multipolar environment will continue to allow these wars, meaning the US into Iran as in an invasion would be the next logical step. So how can we achieve this? The only solution really is I think to get people to realize and to shift to the Anthropocene, because the thing is here that what we used to call the lumpen proletariat, or the kind of mass culture in a kind of which exists in different places in a different collective kind of sense. And this is also what was called the traditional way of life by Western politics in the Cold War. Because really it is a kind of myth that capitalism evolved out of the feudal system. And it's something that happened because of the rise of science and because of the rise of modern political ideas. That's how the capitalism superseded the feudal system. But there's still the monarchy and the church element that want to preserve this kind of traditional values. And maybe we could attribute directly back into the origins of Christianity, even in the ancient world, and the talk about reform to the ancient world empires, which they're now still talking about reforms to society today in those terms. So while the US has a relationship between the big five autonomous powers on the UN Security Council behind it, this would seem to favour it in terms of any outcome that might happen in with Iran. And it also means the US should have more stability to avoid going to war for personal reasons, despite provocation, whilst Iran works in a more decentralised way, and perhaps this is incentivizing it to avoid war. Did not start the war with Iraq. Saudi Arabia appears to have done that. And perhaps this is the whole reason why we're in the situation that we're in now, because of the way that the Middle East became divided by the Cold War polarization. So the fall of this regime in Iran would do that. It would deconstruct that whole divide within the Middle East, which is based on right and left politics rather than Shiite Sunni Muslim. And even though it can evade, really progress does not necessarily have to occur in this way, because really we could deconstruct the problem politically if we had more awareness. So that seems to be the difference between the two ways that this can go. We can address this problem in an intelligent way, or I think it will end up being a war because people didn't. So it's kind of up to them really what they're going to do. And I mean, perhaps they go one way and then governments go the other way, you never know. So it's still, even though it has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, at this stage, it's the US is about creating a new working relationship between China and Russia and the US, and healing the deep divide between the right and the left in politics, which came out of the Cold War. And so reaching right over into Asia and having a full-blown war with a large country, which is an ally of both Russia and China, does seem a little bit counterproductive. Yet the US still has the problem of a revolutionary Iran whose interests are against the US, and in particular the global hegemony it represents in terms of the creation of its new world order. So the matter is made more complex by the fact that it's in Iran it's an Arabic revolutionary regime which has historical allies with other communist nations rather than the Islamic nations across the Middle East, in which it's been exciting uprisings against its fellow Muslims. Islamic nations across the Middle East would probably hope that this revolutionary regime was just completely removed, and then they could get back to addressing their own issues, which is why I think a backroom deal will be made by the nations on the Security Council to secure whatever outcome occurs if Iran and the US cannot agree on formal terms. The problem with this really is that there is no coherent kind of old world strategy in place here, and it's said that an idiot with a plan can defeat a genius without one. So how can the world system actually respond to this current crisis in a way which produces positive change? This is why I'm worried that a war is going to happen, because of the lack of a logical alternative better outcome for the world system, and the US is quite keen on creating a better world system because it suits its interests. And of course, you could consider the old world arguing that it's just a violation of human rights for the sake of politics. So this is why I also think that this connects with the problem of getting to people to see how taxing the billionaires is the solution to the next stage of the Western system. And if we do want to resolve the issue and create a new working relationship between the US and Russia and China, which is seen as better than having a war with Iran, and which is looking at the situation in a more intelligent way and finding the money to solve the problems that we have here in terms of our own system, then really it seems that we have moved closer to that because the proportions in which evolved from the Cold War complete divide, post-Cold War kind of semi-divide, and now there is this, the Belt and Road Initiative, there's various things connecting East and West, there's India letting vast amounts of capitalism in. So it looks like the world system really doesn't want this war at all. And what with energy prices being affected as well, it looks like we need to diffuse the situation. So it seems that over time, if we look at maybe the long-term kind of factors in this trend, in relation to this trend, over time we've seen perhaps in the time of, say, ancient Greece, Persia, there's no chance. Then things became a status quo between Roman Empire and China, hence the dynamic interaction between Christianity and Islam, then the Mongols and the Turks pushed the Europeans into the Americas. So we can see there's a big sort of interaction, there's a lot of movement behind the creation of the modern periods, and then there's the European world economy, which of course brought modern government, but also vast amounts of corruption, and that's really what communism evolved out of. So the divide between communism and capitalism in the Cold War doesn't really look so artificial if you look at it like that, more of a natural product of the direction that societies went in. So now we've got to resolve this. This is the big issue now. So is it going to be very lumpy, different type of problem? It's certainly got the speed of the world economy moving faster to get it moving along, even though it's a bigger issue and perhaps more difficult to solve. Maybe there's less incentive to solve because of the way that the world's evolved since the earlier period, and certainly not so much ground for kind of governments to just take sweeping action on things. Everything's got to be very diplomatic, and that's also because of the nuclear weapon. So if the billionaires, then they kind of represent on the Western side freedom from the centralized system by creating their own kind of life support mechanism, then the problem here is that they become kind of elites with their own personal relationships with governments who need their money to stay in business. The only solution as things stand has to go through a vast array of compartmentalized government, legal and military frameworks of ideas, protocols, methods and decision-making processes, which can be used to argue in the public interest. So perhaps what governments are thinking right now is, how do we get through this regardless of what happens